I guess I should say good morning if you're anywhere in the US, good evening if you're dialing in from South Asia, and welcome to everybody. So, my group of colleagues and I, we've been working together for the last 9 years. We were just sort of talking about it before all of you came online. And I'm just going to briefly introduce all of us and then show you a little clip that the first group of students we took to India made. And in a way, it sort of captures, I think, the sort of the energy and the joy of that program when our students are in Kotagiri together. So we'll show you that clip and then talk a little bit about how the program has evolved over its 9 years that we've been sort of trying, first designing it for 3 years and then running it for 6. And so we'll talk a little bit about how it's evolved. Anita and Abhishek will talk a little bit more about sort of what is happening in Kotagiri during the pandemic. And then we want to address a couple of issues about, what does crisis mean for a collaboration? What does it really do? Does it shut us down? Does it open up other possibilities? So we want to talk about that and then open up, of course, for your questions. So I don't know where everybody is on Zoom, but I just want to call out Andrew Wilford, Professor of Anthropology here at Cornell, part of the very first core group that started the program. Stephen Wolf, also here, who is a professor in natural resources, also part of the core group that started the program. Lucinda Ramberg, I think, Lucinda's on the call, who won't be sort of speaking today because she's not available the whole time, but has joined the program the last couple of years. She's also from anthropology, and then of course 2 of our colleagues from the Keystone Foundation. There's Anita Verghese, who is the director of their biodiversity programs, who's been a completely integral part of this adventure from day one, and Abhishek, also a very integral part to the whole piece. And Abhishek is a program coordinator at Keystone. So they're joining us from Kotagiri and from Bangalore, in this marvelous world of Zoom. So may I have the next slide? So video gives you a flavor of what the program is like when the two groups of students, Cornell undergraduates from across all majors at Cornell, and the young people from the Adivasi communities that Keystone works with, when they come together in Kotagiri. Both groups prepare ahead of time in Ithaca and in Kotagiri, and then they meet for 15 weeks in and live together and work together in Kotagiri. And so it's a transdisciplinary program that works across disciplines. I mean, as you can see from all the people on this call, and it really looks very seriously at knowledge, sort of built both in the academy and in practice, in the world of practice. So may I have the next slide, Gloria? So yeah, so this is a diagram that, when we were writing about the program, we really put this together to talk about sort of all the many boundary conditions that we transgress in a program like this. And so I'll let my colleagues talk more about sort of some of the research sort of pieces, but I just want to sort of talk about one particular piece. May I have the next slide? I want to talk about the fact that the program is structured around meeting community expressed needs, both through this sort of question of education and research. And it's very focused. So while we focus around the question of sustainability, we look at 4 streams within it. There's the ecology and conservation stream, there's the environmental governance stream, the health and well-being stream, and then the last one, which is the one that I look at, which is about water and waste. And the idea always, and I'll just use the water and waste, the urbanization program to talk about this a little bit. The idea always is to build on the strengths that Keystone already has, the considerable strengths that they have, and then to bring what we work on to that same, to the same sort of set of projects. And so we work together in teams. The program is bilingual, and in the process of sort of working it out, operationalizing this, we've made several innovations. The innovations sort of rest both on the kinds of ways in which we think about research, but they also rest on sort of organizational innovations, modules that we've constructed to do sort of teach the sort of financial sort of funding pieces of making the program run, where we are able to provide fellowships and scholarships for our young people from the communities in the Nilgiris. And so there are various organizational innovations that I won't talk about at length here, but we can always answer in the question answer piece. So I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to my colleague Stephen Wolf, who will talk about one of the other streams, the environmental governance and ecology streams within the NFLC. So Stephen, all yours.
Thank you, Nima. Gloria, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And this is the same, back one, please. Thank you. This is the same slide Nima showed, and I'll send a link in the chat feature so all of you can see this figure, which I think is quite rich. And I won't go into it in great detail, but I wanted it to serve as just the background for my brief comments about the research element of NFLC. And as Nima's just hinted at, that under a pandemic, the kind of relationship that we enjoy and we have built across elements of Cornell and across continents with our colleagues in the Keystone Foundation and Keystones relations with communities is all quite challenging. And the NFLC is built on relationships. And so when we think about the pandemic, it really is a challenge to maintain and strengthen those relationships when interaction is so challenging. But applied to the research, I want to emphasize what has been accomplished. And that is that we have developed a model of research that involves students, both Cornell students and what we call Keystone students that are recruited from the communities that the Keystone Foundation has been working with for over 25 years. And this is a model of engaged research. It's engaged in the sense that academics from Cornell are working directly with Keystone Foundation and Keystone staff and Keystone partners and Keystone students. And it's also very much student-led and student and undergraduate-led research, which begins to hint at all of the boundaries we're crossing between disciplines, between organizations, between cultures, between languages, and between worldviews. And Nima already outlined the kind of breadth of our approach to sustainable development, which encompasses everything from mental health, organizations, ecology, politics, and land governance. And so it's a very encompassing approach, and that points to the richness of the collaboration. So if you'd like to learn more about the research and the research products, which have been published, for example, 7 undergraduate research briefs authored by teams of Cornell and Keystone students, appeared in an Indian journal out of Bangalore called Current Conservation, and you'll find the link in the chat. So I turn it now to my colleague, Andrew Wilford.
Next slide, please. It's really nice to have this event and to catch up with folks and to talk about this really enriching program. I'm just going to talk a little bit about one of those streams, the community wellness stream. And I won't go into details, but we really focused even pre-pandemic on health and wellness in NFLC. And in particular, we were very much directed to focus on some of the stress factors that were impacting upon the local indigenous communities and on their well-being. And we knew from a start that the area was underserved biomedically, and so a community-based perspective was really the way to go to sort of address these health concerns and to identify the problems more inductively with community participation. So we started this community wellness program in order to really identify first what were the problems that the community brought to Keystone's attention and then eventually to our attention, and then to identify ways of addressing those problems using community workers from the specific villages and communities where we had these projects on the ground. And it involved our students doing some of the field work for this, and also involved training community health workers. Some of them, actually many of them, came from that student body of Keystone students that were part of the NFLC, who then went on to be trained as community health workers, or NALAM workers, which means health. And this involved also forging some partnerships with local hospitals in Gudalur and in Coimbatore nearby, and a partnership with another NGO known as the Banyan in Chennai, which really emphasizes community-based mental health care in particular. The image here, some of the young health workers on the one hand, and on the other hand, a traditional healer, which we also partner with. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, thanks. So again, using more participatory and ethnographic kind of inductive methods of field work, we were really interested in identifying what the problems were, both from the health workers' viewpoint or from our student researcher viewpoint, and also the community views. And I don't have time to go into all of these, but they all kind of indexed changes that are impacting upon the community, many of them environmental, ecological, but also the movement from a more egalitarian hunter-gatherer, some horticulture, but basically egalitarian ethos with a strong collectivist spirit, more towards individual cash economy, in which there were growing inequalities in the community. And the overall sense of this was that there was a growing feeling of malevolence, not only between members of the community, but also between the community and the spiritual world that had previously created a kind of cosmic equilibrium, as the community described it, where the ancestors and the deities were keeping people safe from malevolent forces, and also even protecting them from wildlife. So wildlife human conflict was also explained as a result of transgressing some of these traditional values of collectivity and honoring the ancestors, and also related to changing diets and moving away from traditional staples, which people said was making them physiologically weak and unable to do what they used to do. From the health workers' perspective, just this sort of issue of resources was a big issue, difficult to access villages, now exacerbated by the pandemic. Gaining trust between health workers and community members was a problem. How to actually provide biomedical care when necessary for individuals. That wasn't the first line of intervention, but sometimes getting a prescription filled becomes an issue, and so on and so forth. I won't go into more detail now. Next slide. Next slide. We seem to be stuck. Oh, there we go. So again, it was all about trying to create a new care paradigm that served more locally, contextually specific needs in these communities, their physical environment, their particular cultural value systems, trying to understand health systems in a different way so that we're not scaling up with a one-size-fits-all approach, which really is important in a place like this. Democratizing knowledge, taking seriously local health traditions, partnering with local healers who are amazingly insightful about the kind of resilience and stress that impacts a community. So sort of building resilience where it is there or enhancing that, but also becoming a bridge, biomedical training for those community health workers so that they can do basic triage, not just stress-related factors, but all sorts of health-related factors can be addressed. So building a kind of bridge between worlds was very important. Building a kind of cultural bridge through understanding the particular psychology and worldview was a very important part of this project. So ethnography and cultural psychology sort of go hand in hand in addressing issues of well-being. So taking a very kind of holistic perspective and not just a biomedical perspective. Building collaborations and working with hospitals and NGOs. I mentioned the Banyan. Recently, we've applied and obtained a WHO grant to look at the impact of the pandemic on indigenous communities, and the Nilgiris will be a part of that study. And so there are things like that that are going on now. I think we actually skipped a slide, but that's okay. I see I've kind of used my minutes, but there was a slide previous to this one, that had to do with recruitment and retention and just resource allocation and the kind of challenges that researchers would face, but that's okay. Let's go back to the last slide very quick. So one of the great uncertainties, that's all right, is sort of how do we recalibrate this wellness program in a time of pandemic? And we know now that isolation and the impact of the pandemic is sort of immeasurable at this point. There's so much uncertainty how one recalibrates wellness post-pandemic. And so these grants that we're trying to write and sort of think prospectively about will be an attempt to sort of address those questions. But sort of the mental health implications in these vulnerable communities, very small communities, is something that is really hard to wrap our head around right now, although we keep having conversations about this very problem. And I'm sure my good friends in Keystone, who I'm so happy to see here today, are sort of on the front lines as much as they can on that question. I'm going to turn it over now. We will go into the next group of slides. And so that's it for community wellness for now, but I'll be happy to go into more detail later.
Sure. Yeah. So can I get the next slide on? Yeah. So what we would so being a field-based organization, Keystone has been in this landscape for about 25 plus years, and you know, like all people, we woke up in January 2020 thinking it's going to be a normal year, and we had our spring cohort from Cornell, and we had our Keystone students all going well, and then at the end of 7 weeks, so in the on the beginning of March, we had to suddenly shut down the programs and the students back home. It was kind of, for a couple of weeks, we were all disoriented, and then we just had to sort of get back and think in terms of what was really the need at that time. And one of the things, and I would say that as a field-based organization, we were sort of one of the first people to respond. I mean, we just went out getting masks, getting sanitizers, reaching out to whoever we could within permissible travel limits. And the wonderful thing was that we have a whole community on campus, a community of people who have come from various parts of the country to live and work in the Nilgiris. And all of us had to sort of chip in, work together, redesign our work. And I want to share especially what we did in terms of responding to the pandemic. And my colleague Abhishek, who's also here, and I'd like Abhishek to start this next 3 slides, Abhishek, where we actually talk about what we did. So can we move to the next slide, please? And also, what did some of the NFLC students do at this time? Abhishek, all yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think my sound is echoing somewhere, but I hope it's okay. To start off, I think the situation was pretty similar in most parts of the world with regard to how most countries started responding to the current crisis, or what was a crisis. But in the Nilgiris, it was a different scenario because we had, over a period of time, a whole bunch of problems that, of course, occurred. We had created a dependency on markets, for labor, for produce, for dry rations, for a whole bunch of things. And all of a sudden, all these things were no longer available. The trade routes were not open. There were no linkages. Medicine supplies were in short supply. Vegetables were not moving. So there were a whole bunch of things. But what we tried to do was we started with, as the slide will show, some basic essentials for indigenous communities. The previous slide, please. Sorry, it's not there yet. We tried to provide basic essentials for most of the indigenous communities present around the Nilgiris district. And it was really happy. Well, it was a sad time, but it was also a happy time. There was a lot of sharing. There was a lot of caring. There was a lot of concern for every other person in the next village and so on. It was an extremely valuable experience and beautiful learning in terms of how to look at their lives. And but what was also really important was the kind of support we had from previous NFLC graduates and people who were associated with them, who would help them out with their fieldwork at different points, who would come in as resource people, who had been elders and mentors and guides to them while they were in the community doing research, which was a huge boost to our confidence, and it was a very interesting thing to see how there was an alternate community which was forming through the NFLC outside of Keystone. They were keeping in touch with each other. They were knowing what was going on with each other's villages, and they were kind of able to help mobilize resources and figure out how best to get things in place. So I think we'll be talking very specifically about two people and the kind of work they've been doing as just examples of what the larger NFLC cohort had been up to. If we could have the next slide, please. Right, so this beautiful selfie you see is of this person called Cornell, who is from the NFLC batch of 2016. They live in the northeastern slopes of the Nilgiris. It's in a region called Undergraduate. And after, I think, 20-something years, most of the population of Undergraduate has decided to go back to doing millet farming and not just vegetable farming, but agriculture for sustenance and for their own economy. And this was a very interesting movement because there was a point when for 750 families which live in that region, there was probably only about 300 kilos or 400 kilos of vegetables which were available, and of rice and of any other dry ration which we could provide. What was very interesting to see that they decided that they would share it, but by the second time around, they had had enough of taking back a handful of grain and tomatoes for 2 days for a family of 4, and they just decided, no, we need to get back to agriculture. We need to learn to take care of ourselves. And Anand was one of the key catalysts in this movement by going around and talking to people and supporting their initiative to go back into agriculture, supporting their need for technology, trying to mobilize the local community into working and collaborating with each other, but also trying to learn from other regions as to what was going on. So some of the seeds you see here actually came from across the valley from Hasanur. For those of you who are familiar, you would understand that that's a full day's walk of down into the Moyar Gorge and coming back up. And for those who don't know the place, it's a really steep descent down one side of a hill, cross a small gorge, and then go up another hill, pick up seeds and come back. This form of collaboration, this form of youth engagement was something which we all found was very heartening to see, because people really value and respect this person you see in the photograph, and he's a very young person. He's only about 29 or 30. But he's taken a very active interest in moving the entire region towards some form of food security, to ensure that they're not dependent on anyone else, and to ensure that in case of another crisis, in case of anything else, that they always have their own food reserves. But more importantly, it's brought about a different kind of engagement of upsetting a larger system where people from villages used to go to towns to work, and where people were dependent on that form of labor and that form of social intervention. A lot of that is changing in this particular case. So Anand started off as a water steward, but now he kind of anchors a lot of the agriculture programs, the water programs, the biodiversity work which happens in that region, and he's kind of moving through a lot of these things in a very interesting way. He's also, sorry, I just keep going on, I'm just going to stop after this, but he also is, there's a small community foundation which is started up in that region, which is comprising of about 35 youth, and their main objective is to kind of keep their traditions alive and keep the traditional knowledge in practice. And this doesn't relate to any particular thing, although they started with music. They've been expanding into craft work, into agriculture, into value addition, processing. They have their own community radio station as well, as we speak. We have the next slide. And this is another really interesting person. She's been associated with Keystone for a really long time. I think Andrew, Neeva, and Stephen would have probably seen Dhanlakshmi quite a few times in their visits. So she started off as a health worker, and this year I think she finally agreed or expressed her interest to be part of the NFLC. And she's, I would say she's probably the longest associated health worker we've had. Dana has been associated with us for about 5 years plus now. And she is, again, spearheading the entire nutrition movement in Arakud. So if one of the favorite things I like to do with Dhanlakshmi is when you go out, you just ask her to point out all the favorite things she likes to eat. And by the time you walk 100 meters, there's so much information which is just speaking to you about tastes and smells and what do you what with. More than that, she's taken such an active interest in women's health and nutrition in that entire region, working on bits of women's sanitation, looking at how much access they have to emergency medical services, especially during the pandemic, in terms of there were a lot of pregnancies which were there where children were expected. There was very little movement or no transport available. Access to medication was really difficult. They have a lot of differently abled people who live in these regions, and Dana kind of works with all of them, make sure they get their prescriptions filled on time, make sure their follow-ups are happening with doctors. But the point is, this entire NFLC experience, I think, catalyzed Dhanlakshmi to take on an entirely new role where she wasn't just filling the role of a conventional health worker going in and checking on people, but also of talking to people about different things they could be doing, of tying in traditional knowledge with modern medicine and trying to see how better they could leverage the kind of information they had and the exposure she's had and the knowledge she's gained over some period of time of working with different doctors and health officials and experts in the field. But at large, she's also part of the youth group, and she's part of the community foundation. And it's interesting to see, although both examples come from one region, between the both of them, they've managed to get a lot of conversation started about things which would otherwise be extremely sensitive and not something most community members would be comfortable talking about. And the impact of that is really, really evident in the kind of market reach the community is hoping to have, in the kind of agriculture the community is hoping to do, and in terms of understanding their own dependency on the forest in itself. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, and I'm going to let Anita continue, but I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so we can move to the next slide, please. And I just wanted to say that, you know, somebody like Kanan mobilized, I think, about 165 farmers in this period, and they went back to fallows that they hadn't worked for the past 10 years. So the loss of opportunity to work outside their villages, in a way, sort of forced them to look back at their own resources and to develop that. And so also with Dhanlakshmi, she went beyond her health work kind of role to see whatever way that she could help, whether it was with banking facilities, if it was with helping students with their schools. And this is something that struck the chord with me when I think 2 weeks ago, one of our colleagues went to this Arakud area to see the millet fields. And then she met this young girl who said, I've not been going to school. I've been in the village with my parents and I've learned farming and I'm enjoying climbing this tree. There's a sense of having a lot more time in the village with their traditional ways, with their elders, with their parents. And I think this has also been something that we've seen from several other areas. The pandemic has also given rise to a lot of local leadership, a lot of revisiting some of the things that people had taken for granted. And we just wanted to share this one other story. And I also wanted to share that Abhishek was leading a lot of this service delivery work. And they worked tirelessly. They were working all through the day and night. And each time he'd come back from a village, he'd have a bounty of things. He'd always come with, see, look at this. I got a whole bunch of lemons. I got a whole bunch of kilos of chilies. Every time we went to give something, people always gave back something in return. It was very interesting, that whole period. Yeah, and the next slide, I think, Gloria, can we move to the, So I think definitely this has been a crisis that, sort of had us all stumped for a couple of weeks. Some people took weeks, some people took days to bounce back and to reimagine, rework the ways that we were used to working. And how does this really help? We had all moved into such a lot of strong collaborations, working together, whether it was working together with communities, working together across institutions, across countries. And definitely, it's been a time that's putting a lot of our collaborations. I don't know how about, where we are, but it's a time to rethink, to reimagine, and to find creative ways going forward. I, for one, want to share that, with the kind of collaborations we've had within India, it's been experimentation. So we just finished one field course, which was supposed to be a summer internship, and we did the whole thing virtually. It wasn't the best deal, so we had to use a lot of film. We had to use walking around with mobile cameras, using WhatsApp, Zoom, whatever connectivity was possible to give students that experience. So that was something that we just finished. Earlier we were talking about how Abhishek trained, I would say 30 people who work in different NGOs in wildlife photography and filming. And again, this was something we did virtually. So these are things that we've been reinventing. But again, I mean, this is something we should all talk together, my colleagues at NFLC, and how do we see ourselves going forward? Yeah. So thank you, everyone. And like Nima, would you want to take that over? I invite Nima, Andrew, Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Anita. Thank you, everybody. So I think the big question for us going into this, when Iftikhar and Daniel and Gloria asked if we'd like to kind of, come in and talk about this program that we've been running together, was to really think about the impact of a crisis and what it means. And so, so what I find really sort of heartening in the stories one is hearing is this sort of sense of leadership that we were really always interested in thinking about when we started the NFLC program. We would, Pratim, who can't join us today, who's one of the founder directors of Keystone, would always say that, in Nima, we're trying to really think about perceptive leadership. That was the language he would use. So when I hear the stories of Karnan and Dhanlakshmi, I'm like, it's at work. We're seeing that at work, that we have young people from the communities in Arakud, for example, that, the stories that you heard, who are now taking up that banner of leading their communities, and they're doing it in this integrative way across those 7 binary transdisciplinaries that Stephen showed you the diagram for. So I think it's in one small way, something is moving, something is shifting, and it's changing. But at another scale, not thinking so much about the just Kotagiri, but Kotagiri and Ithaca, that collaboration, it's been, as one of my colleagues said when we suggested this topic, he said, "What collaboration? It's come to a screeching halt." Which is true, but then it opens up questions of what do we do from here. So I will again step back and let Stephen and Andrew speak to that for a minute, and then we'll open up for questions. Stephen?
I'll be glad to just offer one remark, which is that I think the ethos of NFLC, and certainly the kind of main point of the figure that I shared with you and Nima had shared with you, and the title of that article, Slow Conservation, is that NFLC is a kind of a big picture idea about training young people for leadership, about trying to build an enduring program at Cornell, about trying to help Keystone and its staff institutionalize programs and bring the next generation of leadership into the front lines of Keystone, which is undergoing its own transitions. And of course, the ecological and the social changes necessary to achieve something like sustainable development, those are long-term projects. And so then we think of this concept of crisis or the pandemic, which are so acute and so immediate. We have this kind of long-term, short-term juxtaposition. So I think that we should recognize that the NFLC is a kind of long-term, big picture effort. This pandemic, whether it lasts 1 year, 2 years, cannot undo us. But in the short term, there's no denying it has been a total derailment in the short term. But because we have such kind of big ambitions and we've laid a strong foundation, I think we're going to do just fine.
Well, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said on both the Keystone and the Cornell side. I do think the resiliency stories that we just heard I agree with Nima, they're very heartening. And that resiliency story also is a lesson for us in the NFLC that, even though we have been interrupted in sort of our normal way of doing things, it also means that in taking that long-term perspective that Stephen was pointing towards, we can use this moment to really pause and gauge both the positives and the negatives of the program and what it's produced. It seems to me that one of the positives that I've heard in Abhishek and Anita's story is that these future leaders who might have been trained in one module or another are able to think laterally. And this was always our aim with the NFLC, that we would take students and train them in these very disciplines and also against their disciplines to think about local knowledge, to take seriously the kind of knowledge that the community holds in their own long-term occupation and adaptation to these specific environments, and to respect that. And sometimes we've found that in the Cornell student projects, for example, they get locked in a disciplinary silo, and we say, well, wait a minute, we've taught you to think laterally. Well, look at the example of our Keystone students. They're the ones who are thinking out of the box. And you might be trained as a community health worker like Donna Lakshmi, but then you're seeing the big picture, the relationship between health and diet and agriculture and governance and waste and water, and sort of see how these are all tied together. So to me, that resiliency story is also a story of flexibility and adaptation, which is quite inspiring and something that we should maybe build back in to our curriculum as part of our lessons in the future if we relaunch with students on the ground. The other thing I wanted to say, and I just hinted at it when I was talking about collaborative grants and so on, was that some data is being collected, and while none of us in Ithaca can be in India at the moment, there is some data sharing that can go on and dialogue that can go on through the Zoom. And so we can continue to work as NFLC members, even though we don't have students on the ground. We have ongoing collaborations. So I'm in pretty regular contact with members of the community wellness team, and we even have contacts between that team and other NGOs that are working on health-related issues. I mentioned the Banyan, for example. So those kinds of projects are ongoing, and data analysis can be ongoing, and so that's heartening as well. While we pause and hopefully get back to the field in 2022, I guess. That's what my hope is anyways, to go back. So I will shut up, and Nima, do you want to have any closing words before we have participation from our audience?
Why don't we open up for questions? I mean, 9 years of work together, we can talk about this endlessly. Stories, things, challenges. I mean, we have lots to talk about, but we'll open up for questions and maybe have a more directed conversation in response to your questions.
So please enter any questions that you might have in the chat box, and we can, if you just want us to call on you, you can write, I have a question, and I can call on you if you want to ask it, or just type it in. And we'd love to hear from you. We got people from, I want to thank Nima, Andrew, and Stephen, and Ithika, and Anita, and Abhishek in India for joining us. Zoom allows us this amazing transcontinental collaboration and presentation.
So while we're waiting for questions, I can share a couple of other things in terms of sort of stuff that's still ongoing. So we have a grant together, for example, so Keystone and all of us, all of Cornell faculty members on the call, we have a grant that looks at further sort of pieces of the curriculum development, especially as related to language. We have both needs for Tamil and English, depending on which group of students you're looking at. And so we have a grant that looks at language development, the curriculum development that would use multiple platforms. So, and we've done this even before Zoom, and now, of course, it's even more pertinent. And I think we can imagine it somewhat differently. So there's a grant for that. There's another grant that really looks at the mentoring question, and it's kind of interesting that Dhanlakshmi and Kanan have sort of just run with it, but there was a grant that we were thinking of in terms of how young people who work, Keystone students who work with in NFLC, when they go back home, how they sort of reintegrate back into the communities and pick up those leadership pieces. So there's a mentoring piece which connects them back with the elders in the village, and that was another piece that we have. So along with the health grants that Andrew was talking about, we have these two other small pieces at work. So there is a grant-funded piece of the work we do together that continues. I think what we really feel the loss over is this sort of the piece of actually teaching and building those relationships. But again, like Anita said, like Abhishek said, like everyone's been saying, we can connect in these different, we're looking to connect, stay connected in different ways.
Actually, I'm going to start off with a question more for Anita and Abhishek about what conditions are like on the ground right now in Kotagiri, and especially the healthcare facilities. Is there enough for people, or have there been cases of coronavirus there, and how are they handling it?
Yeah, so I mean, the Nilgiris being a mountain area, it was easy at the outbreak, when this, when the whole pandemic hit, because it was concentrated in the cities, and at that time we were much more protected. There was a period of, a strict lockdown, and shops were not open, traffic was restricted. But around June, all of that slowly started to lift. And then I think it's with the movement of people, returnees, visitors, that cases have risen. And also for India, now the cases have moved more to the rural areas, and we are not equipped to handle it. We do not have those kind of facilities in terms of healthcare to handle large numbers. Right now, the administration is doing its best, but if the cases are, if they are a little more critical, they get moved down to Coimbatore, which is 2.5 hours away. So they get moved out. So this is the situation. But I think, Abhishek, I also think that none of the indigenous villages, we've heard any reports of the virus. We're taking care not to interact so much with the indigenous communities. They're all in low numbers. So there we still haven't, but with the Badika communities, there's definitely a lot of spread, as I would say at the community level also.
So we have a question from Kath March, who said, it's hard to believe that it's been 9 years. Congratulations. She's asking about the expanded roles that social media, especially mobile phones, have played in your work in the Nilgiris, and how has this changed since the pandemic? Since in her own work in Nepal, it has been transformative.
Abhishek, you want to take that?
Yeah, so with the pandemic, I think the one space in the village or around that, where social distancing was not possible, was the one spot where you would get network for your mobile phone. And that's where everyone would be, just many of them sitting in a line just hoping to be able to get access to some form of network. It has been really difficult. Children are being forced to attend classes online, and sometimes they have to walk 6 kilometers in the morning just to mark their attendance in class, say, yes, I'm here, and then come back in the evening to sign out of that. But they can't sit there because there's no network at large. And I actually kind of agree with that expression that more people have access to mobile phones than to toilets. I think it's a fair understanding and fair description of what's going on. There has been definitely an increased dependence because with Arcode as a specific example, there's been an increased interest in recording any form of documentation, whether it's a story someone's telling you or a song you're all singing with your friends, or it's just an experience you've had while walking the forest with your brothers and your sisters, whoever, your friends, whatever. There's been a shift towards needing to store information, retrieve it, and reuse it, which I think mobile phones has really facilitated. So that transition has been really interesting. Not everyone uses it, but there's quite a number of people who have chosen to start using this. I hope that kind of answers. Even with the service delivery, it really helped because having a cell phone, a mobile phone with internet meant that they could be part of groups where communication just became easier and became more streamlined. So we didn't have to make 10 different phone calls to understand what that area needed in terms of dry rations. We just had to put out one single message and it would spread and then it would just come back a lot faster. Anita, do you want to add something to this?
No. I think you've covered it.
Actually, can I just add one thing? You know, I remember the first time that the 2015 batch who made the video that you watched, one of the exercises we do very early on is without using language, just with mime and you know, actions, they have to play out something that is quite central to their lives. And the Cornell students did something with seasons and snow and all of that, but our Keystone students did a whole piece where they would go out into the forest and not into the forest, into fields, and an elephant would come and then they would all run away. And remember remarking that very first time that we held our first group of NFLC students, what was so interesting was one of the Keystone students jumped off, mimicked all this, right? Took his phone out of his pocket and took a photograph of the elephant in the field, completely mimicked. But I think the recording and the phone had already become such an important part of how one captured experience, what Abhishek was talking about, even 5 years ago when we first started the program. So its role in everyday life is quite significant in that sense.
So we had a question about Millet from K.R. Robeson that some of you have answered in the chat, but it raises the question of what other crops have been part of the community and how has labor changed? I'm curious about migration, perhaps to the urban areas as well.
Yeah. I think in a lot of our areas, the indigenous food growing areas, it's been millets, corn, beans, gourds. This is the kind of traditional cropping, and they've stuck with it. They've let it lie low. Sometimes there are years when there'll be lesser area that comes under the food, because there is the wage work that you can get by working on the tea plantations or the coffee plantations. And all of that sort of cut down during the pandemic and the lockdown. People were not going, at least for a couple of initial weeks, people were not doing that. And then I think within 2 weeks, people sort of mobilized and said, okay, let's just all get back to our agriculture. So that happened quite quickly. There's not a high percentage of people going out for migratory labor to industries. There is a small percentage, and I think they were stuck, royally stuck in their towns. And it was only 2 months later, maybe about June, that they could come back to their homes. And now I hear a lot about, we're not going back there ever, because I think they were treated quite badly, and it was a very negative experience. So,
Anita, we could also, the Keystone, in my experience, has been very focused around questions of millet. The other one is the effort to promote transitions to organic farming under the IFOAM certification as a way to add value to agricultural products and to enhance rural livelihoods and the security of rural people. And that was a big focus of the work in Sati, Mangalam, and
yes,
ongoing work in other parts where I know you have a new project as well, and Jyoti has a new grant to promote that. And so kind of a multi-dimensional program, whether it's through the tree and nursery elements, whether it's through the value-added processing that you do through Last Forest Enterprises, through promoting organic agriculture and promoting traditional agriculture. So lots of different programming.
that contributes. I agree. Yeah, thank you for that, Stephen. And I'd also like to add that, for instance, with the service delivery, because the market shut down and all of the produce was ready, especially in one of the areas where we've been working for more than 2 years now, Kukulture, promoting organic agriculture and organic vegetable growing. So very quickly, it was to get in touch with those farmers and get that organic produce into the service delivery chain. So that happened too. And we were able to provide at least about 20 farmers, 25 farmers who grew organic produce. We were able to get them a local market at this time. So yes.
If I could just add to that, and picking up from where Andrew was leaving off, I think millet is a culturally more significant crop because it has an entirely different relation in terms of care and its harvest cycle. It's very, very different from vegetables, where vegetables people would just put it and then you would go check in on a regular basis, put in your sprays and your fertilizers and your supplements, and just go back when it's ready to harvest. But with millet, it's a completely different element. There's a constant sense of staying on the field, which doesn't happen with many other forms of agriculture. It mainly happens with millet. The amount of labor involved is very different because it requires a constant presence. So if you went into most households in Arakot, you find most people above the age of 25 are all in the field, and they would just take turns. They would come home to pick up their supplies and then go back, or just to charge their flashlights and their phones and just to go back. So there is a huge difference in the kind of how agriculture is practiced when they're growing millet. And I think it becomes even more diverse when you have 60% or 70% of the village wanting to grow millet at the same time. That's when everyone is in the field and the village actually feels a bit like a ghost town during the day. There's no one around. And what happened with this was this large-scale millet cultivation was only possible because a lot of people who would otherwise leave the village for daily wage work decided not to go. Because the lands they were using are lands which haven't been cleared in the better part of a decade. They had to be cleared, the land had to be plowed, the seeds had to be put in, they had to arrange for their care, their fences. So there was a lot of labor which was actually needed to make this particular effort possible. And in that sense, I think the community is very grateful that they had a moment like Corona where they said, okay, we can't leave, let's all together, let's work things out, and let's see where we can go ahead with this. So we've been trying as much as possible to help create a local market and a local economy around agriculture, with vegetables coming from the more socially incentivized farmers in the Kukultarai region, and your staples coming from indigenous communities around the Nilgiris, be it from Araku or be it from any other region. So we've been trying to balance these things out to see how best we can create a local economy. But I guess we're just still in the process of trying to figure out how do we connect with the larger market and how do we deal with it.
We have another question, this from Nidhi Subramaniam, and asked about the kinds of research that students do, since there's a steep learning curve with new environments, communities, and cultures. And she asks, do you envision ways in which undergraduate students may still be involved in research even if they're unable to travel to the Nilgiris? And what kind of new learning opportunities might there be with the NFLC?
So could I just jump in there, Daniel? I started to respond to Nidhi. So in the pre-pandemic period, we'd kind of worked out this structure for the program, you know. In the second 7 weeks of the fall semester, the Cornell students would start these two 1-credit courses, one to learn Tamil and the other one to, you know, sort of learn more about this place that they were going into for 15 weeks. And then the first 7 weeks of the period of time that they spent in Kotagiri, we have a fairly, it's both very different in terms of its academic intensity from being here in Cornell, and it's also quite intense. Long days spent together in this bilingual classroom where you are learning research methods, you're learning about the content in these 4 streams that we outlined for you, and you're learning about sort of how to cross these cultural boundaries, right? And we've spent as a faculty, and I include my Keystone colleagues in this, a lot of time developing this curriculum, these curriculum models. And I think in terms of innovations, we've made as many innovations pedagogically as we've made in terms of the actual sort of work that we've put together. And I mean, and I think there is value in it both for for our Keystone colleagues, because they've generated out training programs based on the kind of learning that's happened at the on the practitioner side of this pedagogical piece. So Nidhi, the intensity of those 7 weeks also means, so there's lots of crumbs that we drop along the way. We expect people to pick up. We teach in pairs. Some of it is successful, some of it is a crashing mess. And then we pull it all together, and everybody is given a break for 10 days, and then they go out into the field. But the projects that our students used to do in the pre-pandemic time always stayed very firmly within these research streams, because we were building then with each student project, and as well as the work that Keystone was doing, the work that we were doing, when I say we, I mean Cornell faculty, we were building out these research streams, right? That was pre-pandemic time. What do we do now? It's really kind of up in terms of a conversation. We have one student who couldn't be on the call today, who's gotten herself a Rawlings Presidential Scholarship. We nominated her for it. She is written out a project that's going to continue to do sort of working with the health team, with Andrew in particular, and with the folks over in Keystone. I think it's Jyoti who's part of it, and Pavitra. And so there are projects that are being written up and which we're dreaming about, not fully clear to us how we're going to make it happen. But the one thing that we've learned in 9 years of work together is when we put our heads down, down to it and start to try and figure out ways, we typically can make something work. So I don't know. I think it's right now, that particular answer to your second part of your question, it's completely up in the air.
Well, I think we are coming to the end of this event. I wanted to just thank everyone for the presentations and the audience for participating and asking questions.